We built a family together. Now I'm learning to let go after divorce. Hi, my name is Emma Davis. I'm 40 years old and I'm from Oregon, USA. I'm sharing my story here on the Divorce Stories channel because I know how tough it can be to go through a separation. It's been 3 months since I made the decision to leave my husband, and though it was incredibly painful, it was also a turning point for me. I hope my story can offer some comfort to those of you facing similar challenges. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do, even when it feels impossible. 3 months ago, I made a choice that changed everything. After years of trying to make things work, I decided to leave my marriage. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, but in my heart, I knew it was the right one. For years, I had felt a growing distance between us, and no matter how much we tried to bridge the gap, we just couldn't find our way back to each other. Our marriage wasn't always like this. There was a time when we were truly happy. We laughed together, we dreamed about our future, and we built a life that, at one point, felt unbreakable. But as the years passed, something shifted. The connection we once shared faded, and we started living separate lives under the same roof. Conversations became shallow, more about logistics than feelings. We stopped sharing our hopes and fears. Slowly, we became strangers, and the home we built together no longer felt like home at all. I held on for as long as I could, hoping that something would change. I didn't want to give up on the life we had built, and part of me was terrified of what my life would look like without him in it. But deep down, I knew that staying in a marriage where I felt so alone wasn't fair to either of us. The love we once had was gone, replaced by an emotional distance that neither of us seemed willing or able to bridge. The night I told him I was leaving was one of the most difficult moments of my life. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same weariness I felt in my own heart. I took a deep breath and told him how I'd been feeling for a long time. That the distance between us had grown too wide and that I didn't think we could fix it anymore. I told him I needed to leave, not because I hated him, but because I needed to find myself again. He didn't say much. He didn't argue or try to convince me to stay, which hurt in its own way. Part of me had hoped he would fight for us, that he would say something that would make me reconsider. But in that moment, I realized that we had both known this was coming for a long time. We had just been too afraid to say it out loud. After that night, everything felt surreal. The reality of what I had done hadn't fully sunk in, and I spent the next few days in a haze of emotions. There was a part of me that felt guilty, like I had failed. I kept asking myself, could I have tried harder? Did I give up too soon? But another part of me felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I had taken control of my life. And that feeling, while terrifying, was also liberating. In the weeks that followed, the silence between us grew. We communicated only when necessary, mostly about financial matters and the logistics of separating our lives. We avoided talking about anything deeper, and the silence became deafening. The person who had once been my closest companion was now a stranger, and the emptiness of that realization was overwhelming. One day, something happened that made me realize just how far apart we had grown. I had removed him from our shared Costco membership without thinking much of it. It seemed like a small, practical step in the midst of everything else. But when he went to use the card and realized he couldn't, he texted me, upset that I hadn't told him beforehand. He had been waiting in line at the gas station for half an hour, only to find out he couldn't use the card. I could tell from his message that it wasn't just about the membership, it was about what it represented. The end of something we had once shared. I felt terrible. I hadn't meant to hurt him, but in that moment I realized how these small, seemingly insignificant changes were a reflection of the larger shift in our lives. We were slowly untangling ourselves from each other, and every step in that process was a painful reminder of what we had lost. I think back to the life we built together, especially with my 2 kids from my first marriage. He stepped in as their father figure. And for years, we were a family. But now that both of my kids are grown and living their own lives, there's no longer that shared bond of parenting to hold us together. It's strange to think about how the people who once connected us are now living separate lives, just like we are. In the quiet moments, I sometimes wonder if we could have saved our marriage. I think about the early days when everything felt so full of promise and love. But then I remember the nights we spent in silence, sitting next to each other but feeling miles apart. I remember how lonely I felt, even when we were together. And I know that leaving was the right choice, even if it was the hardest one. Now, I'm learning to live with the silence. It's still painful, but it's also giving me the space I need to heal. I'm rediscovering parts of myself that I had lost in the marriage. Parts that I had pushed aside in the effort to make things work. It's not easy, and there are days when the sadness feels overwhelming. But I know that this is the path I need to take to find myself again. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe one day we'll be able to look back on our time together with kindness and understanding. Maybe we'll even be able to be friends. But for now, I'm focused on healing, on finding peace in the quiet, and on moving forward, one day at a time. It's funny how small actions can carry so much weight. A few weeks into the separation, something seemingly insignificant happened that caught me off guard. I had removed my husband from our shared Costco membership. It seemed like a normal, practical step in the long list of things we were slowly unraveling from our shared life. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was just one of the many administrative tasks that come with separating lives, like dividing bills or changing account passwords. But then he tried to use the card. I remember the day clearly. He was at the gas station, waiting in line for half an hour before realizing the card didn't work. He texted me, and I could sense the frustration and disappointment in his words. "You could have told me," he wrote. I stood there waiting, only to find out I wasn't on the membership anymore. I froze for a moment, guilt washing over me. It wasn't just about the Costco card. It was about what it represented. A small act on my part had turned into a painful reminder of the reality we were now living. We were no longer a team, no longer sharing the same resources or benefits. This was just another piece of evidence that our lives were no longer connected in the way they once were. I hadn't meant to hurt him. I hadn't even thought about how removing his name from something as simple as a membership could have such an emotional impact. But that's the thing about separation. So much of it is about the little things. It's not always the big arguments or the finality of signing divorce papers that sting the most. It's the tiny, everyday reminders of how intertwined your lives once were, and how that connection is slowly being severed. When I think back on that moment, I can't help but feel guilty. I could have told him, given him a heads up, but I didn't. In my own attempt to move forward, I forgot to acknowledge how painful this process is for both of us. It wasn't just my life that was being dismantled. It was his too. And with each step I took, whether consciously or not, I was cutting another thread that tied us together. After his message, I tried to explain myself. I told him that it wasn't personal, that I hadn't intended to make him feel left out. I apologized for not telling him beforehand, but I could tell that my words didn't carry much weight. The damage had already been done. That small moment at the gas station was a wake-up call for me. It made me realize how difficult it was going to be to truly separate our lives. Even though we were no longer living under the same roof, and our conversations had become limited to practicalities, there were still so many little things that connected us, things that reminded us of the life we had once built together. I began to reflect on all the other small ways we were slowly untangling our lives from each other. The shared bank accounts we had split, the photos that we had taken down from the walls, the habits we once had, texting each other during lunch breaks, sharing updates about our days that no longer existed. It was these small, everyday moments that really hurt. They were the reminders that the life we once had was no longer real. But I also knew that these steps were necessary. As painful as it was to navigate this process, I couldn't move forward without cutting those ties. We couldn't keep living in a space where we were half connected, half separated. It wasn't fair to either of us. And while I didn't handle the Costco situation perfectly, it made me more aware of the emotional landmines that come with separation. There's something incredibly painful about realizing that you're no longer a part of someone's everyday life. The simple, mundane routines you shared with them, shopping for groceries, paying bills, planning dinners, suddenly become acts you do alone. And that loneliness, even in the smallest moments, can be devastating. I think that's why he reacted so strongly to the membership. It wasn't about the card, it was about what it symbolized. It was a reminder that we were no longer sharing the same space, the same life. We were moving in different directions, even if we weren't ready to fully acknowledge it yet. In the days that followed, I tried to be more mindful of how we were handling this separation. I didn't want to keep hurting him with these small, thoughtless actions, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep clinging to the past. There's a fine line between letting go and causing unnecessary pain, and I was still learning how to navigate that line. We continued to communicate about the financial and logistical parts of the divorce, but something shifted after the Costco incident. I noticed that his messages became a little colder, more distant. I couldn't blame him. I had unintentionally made him feel like he didn't matter, like he was being erased from the life we had shared, and that wasn't something that could easily be undone. It was a painful lesson, but an important one. Separating from someone isn't just about dividing assets and signing papers. It's about untangling your life from theirs, piece by piece, moment by moment. And in that process, there will be moments of hurt, misunderstandings, and regret. But I knew that if we were ever going to truly move on, I had to be willing to face those moments, even when they hurt. As I moved forward, I promised myself that I would try to be more conscious of how my actions impacted him. After all, he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone I had loved deeply, someone who had been a part of my life for so long. I didn't want our separation to be defined by resentment or bitterness. I wanted us both to heal, even if that meant taking more care with the small things along the way. One of the most difficult aspects of leaving my husband was thinking about the impact it would have on the family we had built together. My 2 children from my first marriage were in their teens when my husband came into their lives. He took on the role of a father figure from day one, and I'll always be grateful for how he embraced that responsibility. He was kind, patient, and attentive. He wasn't just my partner. He became a father to my kids, and for years, we felt like a complete family. But now, with my children grown and out of the house, it feels like the bond that once held us together is no longer there. The shared experiences of parenting, those everyday moments of raising kids, solving problems, and making decisions together, are gone. The kids are now in their 20s, building their own lives, and our roles as parents have evolved. It's left me wondering, without that connection, what do we have left? The truth is, I don't think my husband and I ever expected to be in this position. When we first got married, we envisioned a future where we'd grow old together, watching our kids thrive and celebrating the milestones that came with raising a family. We imagined holidays spent together, shared vacations, and a home filled with love and laughter. But over time, as our relationship started to falter, the picture we had painted of our future began to fade. It wasn't just that we stopped communicating. It was that the things we once shared, the things that bonded us, were slowly slipping away. And now that our children are adults, that bond feels almost non-existent. I think this is one of the hardest parts of divorce that people don't always talk about. How the family you once built together can feel like it's being dismantled piece by piece. My husband was their stepfather, and while they still care for him, the dynamics have shifted. The kids aren't around as much, and we don't have the same reasons to interact with each other anymore. Without the responsibility of co-parenting, our relationship feels even more distant. I wonder how my husband feels about it. He took on the role of a father because he believed we would be together forever. He raised my children as his own, with love and dedication. Now, I can only imagine the sense of loss he must feel, not just for me, but for the family we were supposed to be. I haven't asked him how he feels about the kids. It's hard to talk about that kind of pain when we're barely speaking about anything else. But I can see it in the way he avoids bringing them up in our few conversations. I can see it in how he's trying to distance himself from everything that reminds him of the life we shared. He doesn't want to hold on to something that's no longer real, and I can't blame him for that. I've spoken to my children about the divorce, and while they've been supportive, I know it's been hard for them too. They grew up with him as their father figure, and while they're both adults now, they still see him as part of their lives. But like me, they're trying to figure out how to navigate this new normal. They've been careful not to take sides, and for that, I'm thankful. But it doesn't make it any less painful to see the family we once were slowly dissolving. I think back to the times when we were a cohesive unit, when we would sit around the dinner table, talking about our days and making plans for the future. Those moments feel like a lifetime ago now. I wonder if he thinks about them too. Does he miss those days, or has he already started to let go of them? There's a deep sadness in knowing that the family we once had is no longer intact. Divorce isn't just the end of a marriage, it's the end of the life you built together. It's the end of the shared memories, the routines, the feeling of being part of something bigger than just yourself. And when that ends, you're left wondering what's left. But as painful as it is to reflect on the past, I know that clinging to it won't bring it back. The kids are grown, and they're finding their own paths. My husband and I are no longer the people we were when we first got married. It's time to let go of the idea that we can hold on to something that's already slipped through our fingers. That doesn't mean the love and care he gave my children isn't appreciated. It doesn't mean that the family we were wasn't real or important. It just means that life has changed. And we have to learn to accept it. There's a part of me that hopes he finds peace in this process. I know it's hard for him, just as it is for me. But I also know that we both deserve to move on in a way that allows us to heal, even if that means leaving behind the family we once were. In the meantime, I'm trying to focus on my relationship with my children. They've been my anchor through all of this, reminding me that family isn't just about being under the same roof. It's about the love and support we give each other, no matter what. And while our family dynamic may have changed, the love we share remains. I don't know what the future holds for us as a family. I don't know how my husband will fit into that picture moving forward, but I do know that we can't go back to the way things were. And maybe that's okay. Maybe, in time, we'll all find our own way to heal and rebuild, in whatever form that takes. As the days turned into weeks, the silence between my husband and me became heavier. We were both trying to find our way through the separation, and though I knew it was necessary, the emotional weight of the distance between us often felt unbearable. It was strange how someone who had once been such a huge part of my daily life was now fading into the background. The realization that we were no longer connected in the ways we used to be was difficult to accept. But I needed the space, and I think he did too. The silence, though painful, was allowing both of us to begin the process of healing. I could feel myself slowly reclaiming pieces of who I was before our marriage, things I had let slip away over the years. It was as if the distance between us was giving me room to breathe, to think, to remember what it was like to be on my own. In the beginning, I struggled with guilt. I kept wondering if I had done the right thing, if I had been too hasty in ending the marriage. What if we could have worked things out? What if I had stayed a little longer, fought a little harder? But the more time passed, the more I realized that the decision to leave wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing what was best for both of us. Staying in a marriage where we were both unhappy wouldn't have been fair to either of us. We both deserved more. As the silence stretched on, I began to notice changes in myself. I wasn't constantly anxious anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next argument or wondering how to fix things that felt broken beyond repair. The quiet gave me space to reflect, and in that reflection, I started to see things more clearly. I began to see how much I had lost of myself over the years, and I knew that, as painful as this process was, it was also necessary for my own growth. I started taking small steps toward rebuilding my life. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, people who had always been supportive, but whom I had distanced myself from during the marriage. I started picking up hobbies I had abandoned, reading, painting, things that brought me joy, but that I hadn't made time for in years. It felt strange at first, doing things for myself. But little by little, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of trying to keep my marriage together. At the same time, I could feel the tension between my husband and me easing, even if only slightly. We weren't speaking much, but the coldness in our brief exchanges had started to thaw. It wasn't as if everything was suddenly better, but the sharpness of our interactions had softened. The distance was helping us both heal, in our own ways. It wasn't just me who needed time to process things. He did too. I think we both realized that holding on to the anger and frustration wasn't helping anyone. We were two people trying to figure out how to move forward, and we needed space to do that. One afternoon, I sat down to write him a letter. Not to rekindle anything, but to acknowledge the years we had spent together, the memories we had shared, and to express gratitude for what we had built. Even if it didn't last, I never sent it. I didn't know if he would want to read it, and maybe it wasn't necessary. But writing it helped me process everything. It reminded me that, despite the pain, there had been good times. There had been love. And even though that love had changed, it didn't erase the fact that it had been real. I don't know if we'll ever be able to be friends, or even have a cordial relationship beyond the practicalities of divorce. But I'm starting to accept that that's okay. Not every relationship needs to end with closure or reconciliation. Sometimes people grow apart, and the best thing they can do for each other is to let go. I've realized that healing isn't a linear process. Some days, I feel like I'm making progress, like I'm moving forward. Other days, the sadness hits me out of nowhere, and I'm reminded of the life we once shared and the future we had imagined together. But I'm learning to be gentle with myself, to allow those feelings to come and go without trying to push them away. The distance between us is still there, but it's no longer suffocating. It's giving me the time and space I need to rebuild my life. I'm learning to be okay with the silence, to find peace in the quiet moments, and I'm realizing that healing doesn't mean forgetting or erasing the past. It means learning how to carry it with me, without letting it define me. For now, I'm focusing on myself. I'm focusing on the things that make me feel whole again, on the people who bring positivity into my life. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm starting to feel hopeful again. Hopeful that in time, we'll both find our way, and maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to look back on this chapter with kindness, knowing that we did what we needed to do to grow. The healing process is slow, and there are still moments when the pain feels fresh. But with each passing day, I'm learning to live with the distance, to embrace it as a necessary part of this journey. And in that distance, I'm finding myself again. As more time passed, I started to see the distance not as a painful void, but as an opportunity to rediscover who I was. For so many years, I had been wrapped up in the roles of wife and mother, and somewhere along the way, I had lost touch with the person I used to be. I was so focused on keeping the marriage together, managing the household, and caring for the people around me that I forgot to care for myself. At first, it felt strange to have this time and space to focus on me. I didn't even know where to start. It had been so long since I allowed myself to think about what I wanted, who I was, and what made me happy. But slowly, I began to explore those questions. I started small. I began by picking up hobbies that I had left behind years ago, like painting. I had always loved painting. It was something that calmed me and brought me joy. I used to spend hours with a brush in my hand, losing myself in the colors and shapes. But over the years, I let it go. Life got too busy, and it seemed like there was never enough time. Now I had the time, and it felt liberating to indulge in something that was just for me. I also started reading again. I had always been an avid reader, but during my marriage, I barely had time to finish a book. Now I found myself curled up with novels late into the night, letting the stories take me away from the heaviness of reality. It was a small escape, but it helped me reconnect with a part of myself that had been neglected for too long. Reconnecting with friends was another important step. Over the years, I had distanced myself from people who had always been there for me. It wasn't intentional, but as my marriage started to fall apart, I found myself retreating inward, shutting out those who cared about me. I felt like I needed to keep up the facade of having it all together, even when I didn't. Now I realized that I didn't have to pretend anymore. One day, I reached out to a close friend I hadn't spoken to in a while. We met for coffee, and as soon as we sat down, it felt like no time had passed. She listened without judgment as I poured out my heart, sharing the struggles I had been going through. I didn't realize how much I had missed that kind of connection. Someone who knew me before my marriage, before all the stress and heartache. Being around her reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart. As the weeks went by, I found myself smiling more, laughing more. It wasn't that everything was perfect or that the pain had disappeared, but I was starting to feel like myself again. The woman who had once felt lost and disconnected was slowly coming back, and it felt good. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I started setting goals for myself, small things that made me feel accomplished. I began exercising more, taking long walks through the neighborhood, or going for hikes in the nearby parks. Being outdoors, moving my body, gave me a sense of freedom and clarity. It helped me clear my mind and focus on the present moment instead of dwelling on the past. I also started journaling, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Each morning, I would sit down with my coffee and write about whatever was on my mind, my fears, my hopes, the things I was grateful for. Writing helped me process my emotions in a way that talking couldn't. It allowed me to be honest with myself in a way I hadn't been in years. Through all of this, I began to realize something important. My happiness wasn't tied to being in a relationship. For so long, I had believed that my worth was connected to my role as a wife, to the stability of my marriage. But now I saw that I was capable of finding happiness on my own. I didn't need someone else to define me or make me feel complete. I was enough, just as I was. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the comfort of having someone to share my life with. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. And when they did come, I reminded myself of how far I had come, of the strength I had found within myself. I was learning to embrace the unknown, to see it not as something to fear, but as something full of possibility. My life wasn't over just because my marriage had ended. In fact, it felt like a new chapter was just beginning. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, but now I was letting go. And in letting go, I was finding freedom. I was rediscovering what it meant to be Emma, not just as a wife or a mother, but as an individual. I was reconnecting with the things that brought me joy, the things that made me feel alive. I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on from the pain of the past. It was about reclaiming my life. It was about taking back the parts of myself that had been overshadowed by the struggles of my marriage. And as I continued on this journey of self-discovery, I knew that I was on the right path. This was my time to heal, my time to grow, my time to become the person I was always meant to be. As the months passed, I found myself in a place I hadn't expected to be. Peaceful. It wasn't that the pain of my marriage ending had disappeared or that I had forgotten the difficult moments that led to the separation. It was more that I had learned to live with those memories, to accept them as part of my story, without letting them define me. I had come to terms with the fact that life doesn't always go the way we plan, and sometimes that's okay. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting what we had. My husband and I shared a life together, and while it didn't last forever, it mattered. There were good times, moments of laughter and love that I will always carry with me. But just as there were highs, there were lows, and accepting the end of our marriage meant embracing both. It was a chapter in my life that had shaped me, but it wasn't the final chapter. I found myself reflecting on the idea of forgiveness. For so long, I had been holding on to resentment, replaying the ways in which our marriage had gone wrong, the things we had said to each other, the silence that had grown between us. But now, with time and distance, I realized that holding on to that pain was only holding me back. I needed to forgive, not just him, but myself. Forgiving my husband didn't mean forgetting the hurt or pretending everything was okay. It meant acknowledging that we were two flawed people who had done our best, even if it wasn't enough. It meant letting go of the anger and disappointment, not for his sake, but for mine. I didn't want to carry that weight with me anymore. I wanted to move forward with a lighter heart, with more room for peace and joy in my life. But perhaps the hardest part was learning to forgive myself. I had spent so much time questioning whether I had made the right decision, whether I had done enough to save our marriage. I had blamed myself for the things that went wrong, for not being able to make it work. But now, I was starting to understand that it wasn't about blame. It was about accepting that sometimes, no matter how much love there is, some relationships aren't meant to last. And that's okay. I wasn't a failure because my marriage ended. I wasn't weak for choosing to leave. In fact, making that choice was one of the bravest things I had ever done. It had taken strength to recognize that we weren't happy, and even more strength to walk away from something that had been such a big part of my life. As I moved forward, I found myself thinking about the future. Not with fear, but with excitement. For the first time in years, I felt like the possibilities were endless. I didn't know exactly what my future would look like, but that uncertainty didn't scare me anymore. I had learned that I was capable of handling whatever came my way, and that gave me a sense of confidence I hadn't felt in a long time. I started making plans for myself, not as a wife or a mother, but as Emma. I thought about traveling, places I had always wanted to visit but had put off because life had gotten in the way. I thought about taking up new hobbies, trying things I had never considered before. I thought about meeting new people, building new connections, and creating a life that was full of joy and meaning. The thought of the future no longer felt daunting. It felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to fill it with whatever I chose. And that was liberating. Of course, there were still moments when I looked back. I would think about the life we had shared, the plans we had made, and feel a twinge of sadness. But those moments didn't last long. I had made peace with the fact that our marriage had been an important part of my life. But it wasn't the whole of it. It was a chapter, an important one, but not the only one. I also began to realize that, while we may never be close again, my ex-husband would always be part of my story. I didn't need to erase him from my memories to move on. We had shared a life together, we had raised children together, and those experiences had shaped who I was. But just because he was part of my past didn't mean he had to be part of my future. And that was okay. As I continued to heal, I found myself becoming more comfortable with the idea of moving forward alone. I wasn't in a rush to find someone new, to fill the void that the end of my marriage had left behind. Instead, I was focused on building a life that felt authentic to who I was now. A life that wasn't defined by my relationship status, but by the things that brought me joy, peace, and fulfillment. I realized that, in many ways, this journey had been about finding myself again. And as I moved into this next chapter, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer weighed down by the past, by what could have been. I was excited for what was to come. I knew that there would still be difficult days, moments when the weight of everything would hit me all over again. But I also knew that I was strong enough to handle those moments. I had learned to trust myself, to trust the process, and to believe that no matter what happened, I would be okay. Because moving forward wasn't about forgetting. It was about honoring the past while embracing the future. It was about finding peace in the present and believing in the possibilities of tomorrow. And as I looked ahead, I was filled with hope. Hope for the future. Hope for myself, and hope that in time I would continue to heal and grow into the person I was always meant to be. What the Bible teaches us about healing and moving forward. A woman's journey. Emma had gone through one of the most painful experiences anyone could imagine, the end of her marriage. After years of trying to make things work, she reached a breaking point. The love, connection, and shared dreams that once bound her and her husband had faded away, and with them, her sense of identity. But through it all, Emma found herself turning to the Bible, seeking comfort, guidance, and strength. She realized that God's Word offered her a pathway to healing and rediscovering herself. As Emma navigated her separation, she began to reflect on what the Bible says about pain, resilience, and God's unending love for women. In those dark moments, she found hope in scriptures that reminded her she wasn't alone. God's love for her was unwavering, and His plan for her life was still unfolding, even if it didn't look the way she had imagined. Strength in the midst of pain. One of the first lessons Emma learned through her journey was that the Bible teaches women to find their strength in God, even when they feel completely lost or broken. The pain of her marriage ending left her feeling weak and vulnerable, but as she turned to God, she realized that her true strength came from Him. The verse from Isaiah 40:31 became a source of hope for Emma during those sleepless nights. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles, they will run and not grow weary, they will walk and not be faint. This scripture was a reminder that God would renew her strength if she placed her trust in Him. There were days when Emma felt like she couldn't go on, days when the loneliness and sadness felt too overwhelming. But God was always there, lifting her up and giving her the strength to keep moving forward. Just as eagles soar through the sky with grace and power, Emma realized that God was helping her rise above her circumstances. God sees the brokenhearted. Emma often reflected on Psalm 34:18, which says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." It gave her comfort to know that God was close to her in the midst of her pain. When her heart felt shattered and the silence of her home echoed her loneliness, she reminded herself that God saw her tears and understood her grief. This verse reminded Emma that her pain didn't go unnoticed by God. He was with her in those moments when she felt most alone, and He was working to heal her heart. The idea that God draws near to those who are suffering brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't have to carry the weight of her sadness alone. God was right there, walking with her through every step of her healing journey. Forgiveness, a path to healing. One of the most challenging lessons Emma had to learn was the power of forgiveness. Not just forgiving her ex-husband, but forgiving herself. The Bible calls us to forgive, even when it feels impossible. Emma struggled with this. She had been hurt, and the wounds were deep. But as she spent more time reflecting on Scripture, she came across Colossians 3:13, which says, "Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you." Emma knew that holding on to resentment and bitterness would only hinder her healing. Forgiving her ex-husband didn't mean excusing the pain or forgetting the hurt. It meant letting go of the anger that was keeping her tied to the past. It meant releasing the grip that pain had on her heart so she could move forward with a sense of peace. She also had to forgive herself. Emma often wondered if she could have done more to save her marriage, if the failure of the relationship was her fault. But as she prayed and reflected on God's word, she realized that she couldn't hold on to that guilt any longer. God's forgiveness extended to her too, and He didn't see her as a failure. He saw her as His beloved daughter, worthy of grace and mercy. God's plan is bigger than our pain. Another important truth that Emma clung to was found in Jeremiah 29 verse 11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This verse became her anchor. Even when her life seemed to be falling apart, Emma reminded herself that God had a plan for her. In the midst of her pain, it was hard for Emma to see what that plan might be. She had imagined a life where she and her husband would grow old together, where they would continue raising their family and fulfilling the dreams they had once shared. But as those dreams crumbled, Emma began to trust that God had something else in store for her. A future filled with hope. She didn't know what that future would look like. But she knew that God's plan was bigger than the pain she was experiencing. This promise from God gave her hope on the darkest days. It reminded her that her story wasn't over. Her identity wasn't tied to the end of her marriage. God was still at work in her life, guiding her toward a new purpose, rebuilding her life on faith. As Emma continued to move forward, she realized that the Bible's teachings about healing, strength, and resilience were not just abstract ideas. They were practical tools she could apply to her life. She began to rebuild her life on the foundation of her faith. She prayed more, leaned into Scripture, and surrounded herself with supportive friends who encouraged her to keep trusting in God's plan. Emma started to see herself not as a woman who had been defeated by divorce, but as a woman who was rising up stronger because of it. The Bible had taught her that healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about trusting in God's love and finding strength in His promises. With time, Emma's heart began to heal. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. God was with her, guiding her every step of the way. Her story of heartbreak had transformed into a story of resilience, faith, and hope, exactly what the Bible had promised her all along.